March 24th, 1944, Stalag Luft 3, Nazi Germany. 76 men vanished through a tunnel that was never supposed to exist. And the craziest part? They built it with spoons, bedboards, and powdered milk cans, under a prison designed specifically to make tunneling impossible, while seismic microphones listened for every vibration beneath their feet. Roger Bushell was a Royal Air Force squadron leader, shot down over France, transferred to Stalag Luft 3 because he kept escaping from other camps. On the night of March 24th, he led 76 men through a tunnel that stretched 336 feet underground and disappeared into the darkness beyond the wire. But this isn't just a story about digging a tunnel. It's about the 600 prisoners who worked for an entire year building an underground railway beneath the guards' feet. The 130 tons of bright yellow sand they dispersed across a gray compound in plain sight, and the 50 men who were murdered by the Gestapo for trying to be free. They used trouser legs as sandbags. They walked thousands of trips across the courtyard, releasing yellow sand while guards watched, and no one ever noticed. This is how the most sophisticated prison escape in World War II history was planned, executed, and punished with mass murder. One tunnel, 1 year, one night that changed everything. The man behind the escape was Roger Bushell, born in South Africa in 1910, son of a mining engineer. By the time he reached Stalag Luft 3, he had already escaped twice from other camps. The Germans called him a troublemaker. His fellow prisoners called him Big X. Bushell wasn't just a pilot, he was a barrister, a skier who had competed internationally, a man who spoke German fluently enough to pass as a native. He'd been shot down during the evacuation of Dunkirk in May 1940 and had spent 4 years as a prisoner of war. 4 years of planning, 4 years of watching, 4 years of waiting for the right moment. When he arrived at the North Compound in March 1943, he called a meeting of the Escape Committee. His proposal was audacious. Not 1 tunnel, not 2, 3. He called them Tom, Dick, and Harry. The reasoning was strategic. If the Germans found 1, they might relax their guard. If they found 2, they would never suspect a 3rd. But here's what made Bushell different from every escape artist before him. He didn't want to get 20 men out. He wanted 200. 200 men in civilian clothes. 200 men with forged documents. 200 men vanishing into the German night on the same evening. Why 200? Why not 20 or 30? The answer was pure military strategy. 200 escaped prisoners would force the Germans to mobilize tens of thousands of soldiers to search for them, soldiers who would otherwise be fighting on the front lines. The escape itself was a weapon. The scale was industrial, the organization was military, and the risk was everything. Remember that number, 200. It would haunt them. How do you escape from a prison designed to make escape impossible? Stalag Luft 3 was located 100 miles southeast of Berlin. The Germans had chosen the location deliberately. The soil was sandy, the kind that collapses when you dig through it, the kind that required engineering expertise the prisoners supposedly didn't have. But that was just the beginning. The camp sat on gray topsoil. Beneath it, bright yellow sand. Any excavation would be immediately visible. A single handful of yellow sand on a gray surface would trigger a search. The barracks were raised on stilts. Guards could see underneath every building. There was nowhere to start digging without being observed. Seismic microphones had been buried around the entire perimeter, sensitive equipment that could detect the slightest vibration underground, the scrape of a spoon against dirt, the movement of a man through sand. Everything registered on monitoring equipment inside the guard stations. Double fencing topped with barbed wire. 30 meters of open ground between the outer fence and the tree line. Guard towers with overlapping fields of fire. Machine guns. Searchlights that swept the compound every few minutes. And then there was the warning wire. A low rope running around the compound's interior. Step over it and you would be shot. No warning, no questions. The camp employed specialists called ferrets. Their only job was to detect escape attempts. They entered barracks without warning, searched without explanation, watched without rest. Under the camp commandant, not a single successful escape had occurred from the north compound. Could 600 men really build a tunnel through sand that collapsed on contact? Could they do it under the feet of specialists whose only purpose was to stop them? The answer began beneath a stove in Hut 104. The entrance to Tunnel Harry was hidden beneath a heavy iron cooking stove. The stove sat on a concrete base. The base concealed a wooden trap door. The trap door opened to a vertical shaft that dropped 30 feet into darkness. 30 feet. Deep enough to pass beneath the seismic microphones, deep enough that no vibration would register on the monitoring equipment above. But here was the problem. How do you dig through sand that collapses when you touch it? How do you shore up walls when you have no construction materials? The solution was elegant and ruthless. They would take what they needed from the Germans themselves. Bedboards began to vanish. Every prisoner had roughly 20 wooden slats supporting his mattress. By the end of the operation, most had 8. The missing boards became tunnel supports. 4,000 bedboards disappeared into the tunnel walls. Chairs were reported broken. Tables collapsed mysteriously. Under the Geneva Conventions, the Germans were obligated to replace damaged furniture. They did, and the replacement furniture was promptly dismantled for parts. The camp commandant noted with confusion that material consumption in the compound had reached 5 times the normal rate. He didn't know his prisoners were dismantling their living quarters board by board. The tunnel stretched 336 feet, from the entrance shaft beneath Hut 104 to the exit point beyond the perimeter fence. At that length, crawling on hands and knees was impossibly slow. A single trip could take 30 minutes. Moving tools and sand would take hours. How do you move men and materials through 336 feet of underground passage without losing entire days? So they built a railway. Wooden tracks with carved grooves, a trolley barely large enough for a man lying flat, ropes at either end to pull the cart forward or backward, junction points named after London landmarks, Piccadilly Circus, Leicester Square, names whispered in the darkness beneath Nazi Germany. The prisoners built an underground transit system beneath a Nazi prison camp, complete with stations named after the streets of the city they dreamed of returning to, a tiny piece of London buried 30 feet beneath enemy soil. But the tunnel needed air. At 30 feet underground, oxygen levels dropped dangerously. A man working at the tunnel face could lose consciousness in minutes. Without ventilation, the tunnel was a death trap. What do you build an air pump from when you have nothing? They built it from hockey sticks, knapsacks, and kit bags, bellows operated by hand, ducting fashioned from stolen piping and powdered milk cans. 1,700 clim cans transformed into an underground ventilation system that pushed fresh air to the diggers at the working face. Lighting came from the camp's electrical grid. Wires tapped and run the length of the tunnel, small bulbs at intervals. The prisoners worked by electric light beneath a compound patrolled by guards who never suspected the infrastructure running beneath their feet. Total cost of materials? 0. Everything was stolen, borrowed, or improvised from items the Germans had provided. Then came the sand problem, the most dangerous problem of all. Tunneling displaced enormous quantities of bright yellow sand, sand that would immediately reveal digging if spotted on the gray surface above. 130 tons of it. How do you hide 130 tons of yellow sand in a gray compound? More than 100 men were assigned to dispersal. They were called penguins, named for the way they walked while carrying their cargo. Each penguin wore trouser legs fitted with long bags that hung inside, reaching to the ankle. A pin at the bottom released the contents. The penguins filled their bags with yellow sand, walked into the compound courtyard, and released it slowly while appearing to stroll casually. As the sand fell, they kicked at the ground, mixing the yellow with the gray topsoil. In plain sight, while guards watched, day after day, month after month, 130 tons of excavated earth was dispersed this way, over thousands of trips, and no one ever caught them. Security within the compound operated continuously. Watchmen tracked the movement of every guard, every ferret. A network of signals allowed instant communication across the camp. When a ferret entered a hut, diggers in the tunnel received warning within seconds. The system was called Duty Pilot. The Germans knew it existed. They couldn't stop it. The prisoners knew where every guard was at every moment. They knew patrol schedules down to the minute. They knew which ferrets were thorough and which ones cut corners. In September 1943, the ferrets found Tunnel Tom. The discovery came during a routine search. A ferret tapped the floor in one of the barracks. It sounded hollow. He tapped again, called for backup. Within hours, they'd found the entrance shaft. Months of work destroyed in an instant. The Germans were jubilant. They believed they'd stopped the escape operation. They paraded the discovery in front of the prisoners. They photographed the tunnel entrance. They congratulated themselves. But the prisoners had anticipated this. That was exactly why they'd built 3 tunnels. Lose one, you have 2. Lose 2, you still have 1. Tom was gone. Dick was converted to storage for sand and escape equipment. All remaining effort concentrated on Harry. The ferrets doubled their searches. They probed floors. They measured distances between walls. They looked for signs of fresh digging. Twice they came within feet of Harry's entrance. Would the Germans find Harry too? Would a year of work end with nothing but empty tunnels and broken dreams? They never found it. The stove above Harry's entrance was too heavy, too ordinary, too unremarkable. The perfect hiding place. While diggers worked below ground, another team prepared for what would come after the escape. Escape kits were assembled for each man selected to go. The forgers produced identity documents that were works of art. Work permits, travel passes, letters of employment. Every stamp, every signature, every fold had to be authentic enough to withstand inspection by German officials who examined such documents daily. How do you forge German government documents inside a prison camp? How do you replicate official stamps without ever seeing the originals? The answer was patience, bribery, and extraordinary skill. Guards were befriended. Documents were glimpsed during routine inspections. Every detail memorized and reproduced by hand. Tailors converted blankets and uniforms into civilian clothing. Suits, overcoats, hats. A man emerging from a forest in RAF uniform would be arrested immediately. A man in worker's clothes might pass unnoticed. Maps were copied by hand from originals obtained through bribery. Compasses were constructed from magnetized needles, mounted in melted phonograph records. German currency was accumulated slowly, bartered from guards in exchange for chocolate, coffee, and cigarettes from Red Cross parcels. By March 1944, everything was ready. The tunnel was complete. The escape kits were prepared. 200 men had been selected. The date was set for the night of March 24th, a moonless night, maximum darkness. But there was something they didn't know, something that would change everything. The tunnel had come up short. March 24th, 1944, 9 p.m., sunset. Sunrise would come at 5:30 the following morning. The escapees had 8.5 hours of darkness. 200 men had been selected. The first 30 were those with the best chance, men fluent in German, men with the most convincing documents, men whose cover stories could withstand interrogation. They would receive whatever cash had been accumulated and a head start to reach the train station. The remaining 170 would travel on foot. Each man carried a separate travel plan, most aimed for neutral countries, some for Switzerland, others for Sweden via the Baltic coast. A few hoped to reach France and link with resistance networks. 8:45 p.m. The first men descended the entrance shaft. They took positions inside the tunnel, lying flat on the wooden trolleys, spaced at intervals along the 336-foot passage. Their job was to operate the rope system, pulling each escapee forward toward the exit. The conditions were suffocating. The tunnel measured roughly 2 feet by 2 feet. Room enough to lie prone, not room enough to turn around. The air was thick with the smell of earth and sweat and fear. 9:30 p.m. The lead man reached the exit shaft. He began removing the boards that concealed the opening to the surface. The boards had been in place for weeks, undisturbed. They were waterlogged, swollen, jammed tight against each other. He worked in near total darkness. Every sound risked detection. Above him, guards walked their patrols. The boards would not move. What if they couldn't open the exit? What if a year of work ended here, at the last barrier? 10:15 p.m. 45 minutes after he began, the boards finally came free. Almost an hour of precious darkness had been lost. Then came the second problem, the one nobody anticipated. The tunnel had been calculated to emerge inside the tree line, where escaping men would have immediate cover. When the exit was opened, it became clear that the calculation had been wrong. The shaft emerged several meters short. In the open ground between the forest and the camp's outer perimeter, guards patrolled this area regularly. Anyone emerging would be visible to the watchtowers. The escape committee faced a choice: abandon the attempt and seal the tunnel, preserve it for a future date, or proceed with the plan, accept the additional risk, accept that men would be crawling in the open, exposed, for several meters before reaching cover. They chose to proceed. A rope was run from the exit shaft to the edge of the tree line. A watchman positioned himself in the forest. When the patrol passed, he would tug the rope twice, all clear. 10:30 p.m. The first man emerged. He pulled himself from the shaft, pressed his body against the cold earth, waited. The searchlights swept. The patrol passed. The rope tugged. He crawled forward, reached the tree line, vanished into the forest. The second man followed, then the third, then the fourth. For the next 6 hours, the rhythm continued. Men emerged from the ground at irregular intervals, timed to the gaps between patrols. Some moved quickly, others slowly, their nerves fraying with each second spent in the open. 1 a.m. An air raid caused the camp's electrical lighting to be shut down. The tunnel went dark, complete darkness. The escape slowed to a crawl. Men inched through 336 feet of pitch blackness, feeling their way along the wooden rails, unable to see the man in front of them, unable to see the walls closing in around them. What if the tunnel collapsed in the darkness? What if a man panicked in the blackness and screamed? Then, the tunnel did collapse. A section of wall gave way, sand poured in, the passage was blocked, men trapped on both sides. Would this be the end? Would the tunnel that took a year to build be destroyed in a single moment? Diggers worked frantically to clear the blockage, scooping sand with their hands, shoring up the damaged section with whatever boards they could find, precious minutes ticking away. Every minute of darkness lost was one fewer escapee reaching freedom. The repair took nearly an hour, more time consumed, more men who would never get their chance. By 4 a.m., 73 men had escaped. The process was slower than planned, but it was working. At the current rate, another 20 or 30 might make it before dawn. 4:55 a.m., 35 minutes before sunrise. The 77th man felt the rope move. He interpreted it as the all-clear signal. He began to pull himself from the shaft. He emerged directly in front of a German patrol guard. The guard froze. The escapee froze. Neither man moved. For one long second, they stared at each other. Then the guard raised his rifle, fired a warning shot into the air, blew his whistle. The sound carried across the compound and into the forest. Searchlights swept toward the tree line. More guards converged on the position. The escape was over. 76 men had made it out. 124 remained in the tunnel or the compound. And then they were out. 76 men scattered across Nazi Germany in the darkness of a March night. For the first time in years, no fences, no guards counting heads, no warning wire, no seismic microphones listening for their footsteps. Just the cold March air, the German forest stretching in every direction, and the desperate hope of freedom. Some headed for the train station at Sagan. The first trains would depart before the Germans even knew they were gone. Others moved on foot through the forest, following compass bearings toward neutral borders. For a few hours, they were ghosts, invisible, untraceable, free. But how long would freedom last? The manhunt that followed was one of the largest in German history. Between 60,000 and 70,000 Wehrmacht troops and Gestapo personnel were mobilized. Railway stations were watched, roads were patrolled, border crossings were reinforced. The ratio approached 1,000 German personnel for every escapee, 1,000 soldiers hunting each man. Most were recaptured within days. Some were caught before they even left the area, picked up at the train station or on roads leading from the town. Others made it further, traveling for days or weeks before a checkpoint, a suspicious innkeeper, or simple bad luck ended their journey. But 3 men evaded capture entirely, 3 out of 76. 2 Norwegian pilots reached the port of Stettin on the Baltic coast. They traveled by train. They used their forged documents at every checkpoint. Their German was good enough. Their cover stories held. From Stettin, they stowed away on a Swedish freighter and reached neutral territory. How did they succeed where 73 others failed? Preparation, language skills, and luck. A Dutch pilot traveled south through Germany and into the Netherlands. He made contact with resistance forces. From there, he moved through Belgium and France, crossed the Pyrenees into Spain, eventually reached Gibraltar and Allied lines. His journey took weeks, hundreds of miles on foot and by train, through a continent occupied by the enemy. He was the only escapee to reach safety by an overland route. 3 out of 76, a success rate of 4%. The remaining 73 were in German custody. What happened next was not a military matter, it was murder. Over the following weeks, the recaptured prisoners began to disappear. No transfer orders were issued, no documentation was filed. Men who had been in Gestapo custody simply ceased to exist in any official record. Then the urns began to arrive at Stalag Luft 3. 50 of them, each containing ashes, each accompanied by a death certificate stating the prisoner had been shot while attempting to escape. 50 men, the same cause of death, the same circumstances. The explanation was impossible. How could 50 men all have been shot while trying to escape, at different times, in different locations, all with the same result? A Swiss inspector visiting the camp immediately reported his suspicions to the British government. The truth emerged after the war. A Royal Air Force investigation launched immediately after Germany's surrender pieced together what had occurred. Surviving Gestapo personnel were interrogated, documents were recovered, witnesses were located. The picture was systematic execution, disguised as combat death. The recaptured prisoners were told they were being returned to Stalag Luft 3. They were loaded into vehicles and driven along rural roads. At some point during the journey, the vehicle would stop. The prisoner would be invited to step outside. He would be handcuffed. He would turn his back. He would be shot in the back of the head. 50 men died this way, murdered on roadsides across Germany, their bodies cremated to destroy the evidence. The order had come from the highest levels. Adolf Hitler, reportedly furious at the embarrassment the escape had caused, had authorized the executions personally. Under the laws of war, this was a crime. Prisoners of war could not be executed for attempting to escape. The Geneva Conventions were explicit. What the Gestapo did was murder. State-sanctioned murder disguised as battlefield casualties. Would anyone be held accountable? Would justice reach the men who had pulled the triggers? Roger Bushell was among the 50. The man who had planned everything, the man they called Big X, the barrister, the skier, the man who spoke German like a native, shot in the back of the head on a roadside somewhere in Germany. 1 year of planning, 12 months of digging, 336 feet of tunnel, 600 men working in secret, 4,000 bedboards, 1,700 tin cans, 130 tons of sand. Murdered in a ditch. The Nuremberg trials, after the war, included the Stalag Luft 3 murders among the charges of crimes against humanity. The RAF investigation identified the Gestapo personnel directly responsible. Those who could be found were arrested. Those who had died during the war's final months escaped justice. The defendants offered the defense that echoed through every war crimes proceeding. They had followed orders. Responsibility lay with the leadership, not with the men who pulled the triggers. The tribunal rejected this argument. Following an illegal order did not absolve the one who followed it. Guilty verdicts were returned. Sentences ranged from imprisonment to death. Justice, such as it was, had been served, but it could not bring back 50 men. The Great Escape was not the largest prison break of World War II by numbers. Other escapes involved more men. What distinguished it was the scale of the organization, the sophistication of the engineering, and the horror of the German response. 600 men had participated in a clandestine industrial operation, running beneath a camp designed to make such an operation impossible. They'd built railways and ventilation systems, forged documents in civilian clothing, dispersed 130 tons of sand in plain sight, all while under constant surveillance by specialists whose sole purpose was to stop them. For weeks after the escape, tens of thousands of German personnel were diverted from the war effort to search for 76 men. Military resources pulled from the front lines, the Reich's attention divided, at a moment when division was a vulnerability it could not afford. The prisoners had set out to escape, die trying, or inconvenience the Germans enough to affect the war effort. They succeeded on all three counts. The executions were intended as a deterrent. A message was disseminated through every prisoner of war camp in occupied Europe. Escape is no longer a sport. The threat failed. Almost as soon as the surviving prisoners at Stalag Luft 3 learned what had happened to their comrades, they began planning another tunnel. The desire for freedom proved stronger than the fear of death. It always would. To this day, the Great Escape remains the most sophisticated prison break in military history, not because of how many escaped, but because of what they built. An underground factory beneath a fortress designed to prevent exactly what they achieved. 76 men crawled through a tunnel that should not have existed, built by 600 men who refused to accept captivity, inside a prison designed to be escape-proof. 3 reached freedom, 50 were murdered for trying. And the survivors? They started digging again. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe and activate the bell button so you can receive new videos.